see 7 people in this session. I'm going to hand it over to Adriana right now to start us off. Thank you all for joining us at this session of the Second International Conference on Environmental Peacebuilding. We would love to see some faces if you'd like to turn on your cameras, and I hope you enjoy. We are here for tech support if you have any questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, David, and welcome everybody to our panel on mainstreaming the environment, peace, and security agenda as part of the Second International Conference on Environmental Peacebuilding. My name is Adriana Erthal Abdenur. I'm speaking from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and really look forward to our session today. So considering the environmental aspects of armed conflict and violence, there are growing opportunities to improve prevention, response, and reconstruction throughout the UN system, but also beyond it. So this panel has 2 broad goals. The first one is we're bringing together experts to reflect on developments that address the environmental impact of conflict, the linkages with protection of civilians, infrastructure, climate resilience, and other dimensions. But we're also hoping to outline some ideas to move forward this agenda with bold and challenging ideas. Let me tell you very briefly about the format of this panel. We're going to have, after my very quick introductory remarks, some initial comments from each panelist, also introducing themselves in a little bit more detail. And we are going to pick up questions from the panel. You're welcome to jot them in the chat box in Zoom. We're going to then open up for a Q&A after the rounds of questions, and then move on to a wrap up. I'm going to very, very briefly introduce our panelists, because the idea is that we're going to ask them to draw on their experiences and their work trajectories to respond to the questions and to provide concrete examples. But we're very lucky to have today a fantastic panel, starting with Emilia Wallström, who's project manager at the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, UNDRR. We have Vanessa Murphy from the International Committee of the Red Cross, and the ICRC, as many of you know, did an amazing job in updating the military guidelines on protection of the environment, and Vanessa was very much involved in that. We have Kristen Meyer, who's legal officer in the environmental law team of IUCN, who's also doing very pioneer work in this area. And finally, we have Brittany from PAX, who has worked especially on engaging the Security Council in the environmental peacebuilding agenda. As I said, my name is Adriana. I am executive director of Plataforma CIPO, which is a women-led think tank based here in Brazil. We work on agendas of global governance, environment and climate, and peace and security. We focus on Latin America where we are, but we work also elsewhere in the global South. Let me tell you very quickly a little bit about what we do, because I think it raises some key questions that should be discussed more broadly, including in this panel. We work broadly on 3 different aspects of environmental peace building. First, our main work here in Latin America is in the Amazon region, and where we work on environmental crimes such as illegal deforestation, illegal gold mining, and illegal wood extraction, and the types of violence and disputes over natural resources that are associated with environmental crimes, very much with a preventive approach and with a climate sensitive lens. Second, we work with a global pact against armed conflict, for prevention of armed conflicts, GPAC, which many of you already know. With support from UNDP, we are working with partners in Zimbabwe and Uganda to develop and to test methodologies for localizing climate sensitive peace building. So it's a very exciting South-South cooperation that focuses on the local, so very much as we do with the Amazon. But third, as a Global South organization, we try to take the lessons learned from these experiences to discussions of regional and global governance. So even though we are out in the fields, in the Amazon, and elsewhere in the global south, we try to engage as much as we can from afar with the Security Council, with the DPPA and other aspects of the UN system, as well as Kazoo agreement and regional developments, to try to amplify global South voices and actors, which we believe are missing or underappreciated in a lot of the key discussions about environmental peace building. So in other words, and this is the broad point that I wanted to make before we get into the discussion, if you think about the relationship between climate and security, it's really a two-way street, right? There's a lot of discussion and research about how climate magnifies insecurity, but we also know not only from armed conflict, but also more dissipate forms of violence, such as those that we have in the Amazon basin, which, by the way, is very much armed. It just doesn't fall into the traditional categories of armed conflict that are used in the UN and in partner organizations. So insecurity fuels also both climate change and environmental degradation. And so Plataforma CIPO with its partners tries to work on that entire vicious cycle linking climate and insecurity. And what I think is exciting about the range of speakers we have today is that they've really worked on different aspects of this two-way street. So let me hand it over to our speakers now. A quick set of reminders. First, I want to try to encourage you to keep your responses brief. Aim for 5 minutes, and we'll probably end up with around 7 for each. And do include concrete examples whenever you can. Speak slowly for the interpreters. They understand absolutely everything, but it makes their job a lot easier. And for those of us, in the audience who are listening and in other languages, just makes it easier for them to follow our discussion. And finally, for speakers, please mute yourself when not speaking, but if you can, do keep your video on unless you're having connectivity issues. Okay, so let me start with a very broad question that draws on your particular experiences, and we'll ask for all of the speakers to address this particular question. As a humanitarian or a legal expert or a peace activist, why would you care about working on protection on the environment? Isn't, for instance, protection of civilians or human suffering more imperative for your organization? If you can take time here to introduce your work and maybe specific things you have worked on, that I think would make the conversation a lot richer. So let's start with Emilia. If you can tell us a little bit about your experience and perspectives on this, we're excited to listen to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Adriana, and thank you also to the organizers and to everyone for being on the panel and for having me here today. It's very exciting to speak about this topic, which I am passionate about. So my name is Emilia, and I have been working for about the past 15 years or so on the topic of environment, disasters, and humanitarian affairs. In my current job, I work with the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. And before this, I worked for about 10 years with the UN Environment Program and the Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, which is they have a joint environment unit that deals specifically with the interlinks between environment and humanitarian issues. For me personally, I think it's clear that we are all part of this planet. I think COVID has also made it very, very evident that we are all connected. Everything is linked, and it's impossible to just deal with issues in silos. And I think it's clear to everyone now today with climate change and all other types of emergencies and the environmental pollution crisis, the biodiversity crisis that we are facing, that it is impossible to just look at humans, separate from the natural environment that we live in. Of course, I have worked now for several years also in humanitarian affairs, and there, of course, we are coming at it from a slightly a very human-focused angle, because we are looking to alleviate suffering. We're looking to get humanitarian assistance across as quickly as possible. But even there, we don't operate in a vacuum. Everyone is dependent on the natural environment. It's about the air we breathe, it's about the water we drink, and it's also about the fields that people depend on for their livelihoods. So it's very clear that you can't deliver humanitarian assistance without understanding where you are and what types of hazards people are facing. And that's why I think it's very exciting to see that in the past years, like there's really been like a strong commitment to the issue of environment within the humanitarian sphere. And I think more and more that people, they want to do the right thing. And I think it's more an issue of not knowing how to do the right thing. And this is something that I think we face also as regular human beings. You know, we all want to recycle and we don't want to produce waste. We want to be as energy efficient as possible, but sometimes it's just very hard for us to understand what is the best solution when everything is interconnected. And if we don't use plastic bags, then maybe we're, you know, using more energy, or we're using other resources in another way. And that's where it gets very, very frustrating for us as individuals, and it gets hard. And that's where I understand also where humanitarians are coming from. Of course, when we go to them and tell them, okay, you have to think about, for example, the plastic bags that you're bringing into a country. This is not allowed anymore because specific countries might have banned plastics. Or you have to think about the way that you construct your shelters, because they are very keen, you know, to just do their job. And I think that's where environmentalists can come in as well, and they can help, and we have something to bring to the table, because we can help humanitarians do their job in a way that's more efficient, that does not do any harm, because that's of course also the humanitarian imperative, to do no harm, to not leave waste, to not make things worse than they were to begin with. So by working together, I think there's a lot that can be done, and it's exciting to see that there's a lot of initiatives really that are taking place in the past years, and there's a lot of interest and excitement about this issue, as we can see also on the panel, where we have a lot of participants joining. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emilia, especially for pointing out that incorporating environmental and climate factors is essential, not only for the diagnostic aspect, but also the response design in humanitarian settings, so that not only not do no harm can be accomplished, but in fact also do some good. Thank you very much. Let me hand over to Vanessa so that we can hear based on the ICRC's experience.
Great, thank you, Adriana, and thanks to PAX and the organizers for having me here. My name is Vanessa, and I'm a legal advisor working on the protection of the environment in the legal division at the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, in Geneva. And really, I think I won't go over what Emilia has just said, because I think she really set out, and it's what we see as well in our operations, that, you know, in order to alleviate the suffering of victims of conflict, which is the ICRC's main mandate, it's not sufficient not to take the environment into account. Persons affected by conflict rely on the environment for everything, for food, for their livelihoods, for their water. So really, it's an incomplete picture not to take the environment into account as a protection of civilian issue. The added factor and the urgency, I think, of the ICRC in terms of why we've stepped this up in the last few years is really the climate crisis, and that we see unfolding very much in our operations. So whether it's in Niger or Yemen or Iraq, issues like desertification, like water scarcity, are really stepping up the stress that conflict-affected communities feel. So it's really this confluence of conflict, of environmental degradation, and of climate that has made it very clear that as a humanitarian organization, we need to step up our efforts. I will highlight very briefly two initiatives that we've been working on as part of these efforts. The first is sort of a legal contribution, and that is, as Adriana mentioned, the updated guidelines on the protection of the natural environment under international humanitarian law. So that is a really state-focused initiative. It's aimed at parties to armed conflict and in a nutshell calls on them and sets out the legal obligations they have to take the environment into account as they fight. So it's not new legal obligations. It's really, I would say, a one-stop shop summing up what existing IHL, international humanitarian law, says about how the environment must be taken into account. It's kind of a document of 32 rules. And so that I think is focused really on states and parties to armed conflict. And it is a question of environmental mainstreaming because, you know, often in conflict related contexts, when we speak about parties to armed conflict, we of course speak about their obligations to protect civilians. And the environment tends to be very much an afterthought. So it's really making more clear and making sure that the environment is included as one of the topics that militaries take into account as they comply with their obligations to minimize damage, not only to civilians, but also to the environment. So that's the first initiative that we've been working on. The second is more focused, not a legal initiative aimed at parties to armed conflict, but more so focused on the humanitarian sector. And that is the Climate and Environment Charter. You can kind of find more information about it online. I'm sure many of you have sort of seen it pop up. And this is aimed at local, national, and international humanitarian organizations. And basically it sets out 7 commitments that humanitarian organizations can then tailor to their own contexts to step up the response to climate-related needs, and also to ensure the sustainability of our own actions. So the do no harm element and the do good element that Emilia and Adriana were both speaking about. So I will leave it there, but just to highlight that, you know, as Adriana really set out, there's all these different elements that need to be taken into account, whether it's parties to armed conflict and their obligations themselves, or the action of the humanitarian sector, and so many other actors, including civil society. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. Indeed, we're not just talking about projections of change, we're talking in many contexts about impacts that are already being felt and magnifying insecurity, and they require well-designed legal frameworks at different levels. Kristen, you are a conservationist, I believe. So can you tell us a little bit about your experience and how IUCN perceives this set of challenges and opportunities?
Yes, thank you, Adriana, and thank you for inviting IUCN to this very important panel. As many of you are probably thinking, what is a conservation organization doing here? It doesn't come so natural to kind of think of IUCN as a primary actor in this field. But as we know, and as the 2 previous speakers have already said, the environment and also conservation is very much linked to conflicts. And most importantly, also to keeping the peace. And as IUCN, we have a long history already of contributing either directly or indirectly to environmental peacebuilding actions. So from our perspective, the theme of environmental peacebuilding is, of course, highly timely and relevant. As we know, conflicts cause great economic and social harm. And as other speakers have already alluded, also a lot of environmental damage arises from conflicts as well. But we see, unfortunately, that policies to better manage and moderate these kind of pressures that drive armed conflicts are generally unable to prevent them. And we have seen an increase in the last 30 years of conflicts, actually. So then I guess you might ask, what are then the connections between peace, security, conservation, and nature, and what we as IUCN do? So there are quite a lot of examples, actually. So for instance, many areas that are actually critical for conservation are often areas that are prone to conflict. Also operating in these areas requires then an understanding of how to deal with conflicts and how we manage conflicts. And often also, of course, conflicts have negative impacts on nature, as we have already said. And this means that in order to reduce conflicts, we need to also look at how do we conserve nature more broadly. So then just to name kind of an example, it's very much not surprising that IUCN has recognized the importance of this topic, and that our new IUCN flagship report series that is entitled Nature in a Globalized World took this topic on conflict and conservation for the very first report that was published last year in April. And the report actually addresses a rather basic question. So it considers how we can, how the conservation of nature and natural resources can actually be a positive force towards peace building and towards preventing the pressures that drive conflict. And then also, how does this provide opportunities to end conflict and ensure that peace, once it has actually been obtained, can be sustainable in the longer term. So maybe just a few words on the key results of this report, which is really very much a flagship for us. When we were examining the effects of armed conflict on nature, and when I'm talking about nature in this context, we're talking about living nature and renewable resources. So not oil, minerals, and extractives, but more the living parts of it. And so we found then that armed conflicts, by and large, actually have negative impacts on nature. There is some evidence that where you have protected areas or key biodiversity areas, that sometimes you have less conflict there. And this was something that we didn't expect to find. But and that also sometimes armed conflicts can have positive impacts on nature, in fact. But we have to take this kind of with a grain of salt, because a lot of the positive impacts that appear are very much temporary, and they often are followed by developments that occur after armed conflicts. So then a key message that emerges from this work is that investing in conservation and restoration of nature and natural resources can actually help mitigate pressures that drive conflict and amplify the factors that build peace. And this means that there is a definite role for nature and organizations such as IUCN to be part of these types of discussions that build on conflicts, peace, and security. So then what can we learn from such report? We put together a list of policy recommendations that emerged from the research and the evidence base that was collected to help conserve nature and promote peace at the same time. And these recommendations actually cut across many areas, some of which have already been alluded to by previous speakers, including natural resource governance, which is very much critical, and connected to that, of course, also how we manage natural resources in the first place. The role of international law, of course, and I'm sure that Vanessa will be able to speak about that extensively, and how it actually helps to reinforce and extend legal rights. But of course, not to forget that we should also look at underlying human rights, inclusive and participatory processes as we implement these kind of actions. As well as, of course, conflicts don't only arise in a national state level context that has clear boundaries, but they can also happen in transboundary contexts. So another really important tool is how we deal with transboundary resource management and cooperation, and that should play a very important role here as well. So after all, I think reflecting on these issues, I don't think that we are misplaced in this panel, and that it's very much important to have conservation organizations also included in the discussions. So thank you very much again for inviting us.
Thank you, Kristen. I couldn't agree with you more. In fact, as I listened to you, I was thinking in the Amazon and the tropical rainforest areas where we work, up to a few years ago, conservation organizations in general were very reluctant to engage with the topic of security and peace building directly. I think out of fear of contamination, that the environment would be securitized. We can come back to this topic if there's time, but we see now a growing engagement on the part of conservationists, for instance, in the Amazon, out of recognition that it's almost inevitable. And the question is how to engage rather than whether to engage with the peace building aspect. And finally, we'll listen then from Brittany from PAX. Over to you, Brittany.
Thanks so much. I'm actually going to share my screen with a few slides. Can you see everything okay? Okay, that somehow took away my ability to see everyone else. So hopefully no one's making any mean faces at me. No. Yes, so good morning or good afternoon or evening, wherever everyone is. It's good morning here in New York, where I'm based. As mentioned, I'm Brittany Roser, and I am the UN Advocacy Advisor with PAX. I think we've heard from my fellow panelists a lot on the sort of humanitarian and legal side of things from a conservationist perspective. And that's very much looking at the very practical ways in which international actors are trying to sort of address the environment, climate, and conflict nexus. And as PAX, we have focused also on this nexus with the protection of civilians in armed conflict. And I'm going to focus a little bit on the policy side of things, as you mentioned, Adriana. I won't necessarily go into the reasons in which PAX engages on these discussions, because I think it's already been covered very clearly by the other panelists on the intersectionality between protection of the environment in armed conflict and protection of civilians in armed conflict. But that is really a guiding aspect of our work. Next, sorry, there we are. Maybe first I'll talk a little bit about PAX specifically. As you mentioned, we're an international peace organization, which means that we work on sort of all aspects of peace. This includes bridging both the peace building sphere as well as the peace and security sphere, as well as sort of human rights, development, justice, really whatever it takes to achieve peace. As mentioned, PAX's work is all done with a focus on looking at how to promote the protection of civilians in armed conflict, and especially on how to improve human security. We focus our advocacy based on a two-pronged approach, namely through research from content area experts, as well as information and collaboration from partners in country. Our POC focus, as mentioned, also inspired our engagement on environmental and climate-related peace and security issues, as we kept observing the impacts of the dangers of conflict-linked environmental damage on all aspects of people, planet, and peace. Maybe also take a minute to set the scene with a more bird's eye view of the UN system. I did not make this organogram, and it is, I think, inherently showing some of my points today, which underlies that the UN system is very complicated and complex. And this also leads to sort of jurisdictional issues. So in our advocacy, of course, when asking policymakers to do something, it's important to know who can actually do what according to international law, according to mandating, resourcing, etc. And then within the system of varying agencies, varying mandates, staff, resourcing, it inherently presents somewhat of a challenge in terms of implementation, even for the most well-meaning policies, leading to quite a lot of silos, issues with information sharing across agencies, across missions, both at HQ level as well as across missions in the field. It also leads at times to sort of these disjointed efforts within differences in terminology and in differences in understanding, definition, of course, as I mentioned, differences in mandates, which means that there can be differing responses across differing missions to similar issues. Of course, the systemic disconnect within the UN and the lack of a sort of home, let's say, for issues falling within the environment, climate, and conflict nexus also has implications on the UN's ability to develop coherent and holistic prevention, mitigation, and response strategies to specifically environmental and climate risks and impacts. And this has led to a disparate and disjointed system of policies, resolutions, mandates, advisors, all working in response to various aspects. So climate security risks, environmental peace building, protection of the environment and armed conflict, and a whole range of various agendas, which are all interlinked and fall under this sort of environment, climate, conflict nexus. The policy developments listed here all specifically deal with those issues that fall within that nexus specifically. So I'm not discussing sort of the other areas, a multitude of areas within the UN, member states, and other important stakeholders that are working on different issues to sort of protect our planet and combat climate change more broadly. And so because of this sort of conflict side of things, then it makes sense that many of the efforts that have been undertaken within this sort of nexus have been focused within the UN Security Council. There have been 8 open debates on climate security, with 5 of those occurring within the last 4 years, and even more ARIA formula meetings on relevant topics, side events linking it to various thematic objectives within the Council's remit, as well as within country-specific situations and discussions on mandates and also thematic resolutions. Of course, there's, yes, a strong security focus, but there's also a strong focus on specifically climate and security issues, including focusing on climate impacts as a driver of conflicts in particular. And this leaves the rest of the system sort of seeking its own methods of dealing with the devastating impacts of conflict-related environmental degradation. There is a positive in that there's a very strong focus on the correlation between all of the various aspects. So within the system at large, not specifically within the council, but on protecting the environment equals protecting of civilians in armed conflict, for example, as you can see within the protection of civilians debate within the council, within meetings of the group of friends on POC, within the annual POC report for the last 3 or 4 years, I believe, as well as within UN Secretariat briefings to the council on various country level issues. There's also a positive in the picking up of inclusive language in resolution and mission mandates that improve capacities in UN missions, specifically in peace operations. And this hopefully will lead to improved sort of reporting, monitoring, and information sharing for an overall improved response. This can be seen, for example, in Resolution 2576, renewing the mandate of UNAMI in Iraq, 2584 with MINUSMA, and 2567 for the mandate of UNMISS, which is now currently also hiring a climate advisor, as well as sort of many other missions as well, and within resolutions. For example, 2564, renewing the Yemen sanctions regime, which included language on environmental and humanitarian risks posed by the Safar tanker. Unfortunately, though, this is still in the beginning stage and it's not quite enough. We need more higher level coordination and coherence across the system. I will not go through all of the recommendations laid out here because I think we're running out of time, but also we can talk about them in the discussion if necessary. I just want to note that they are included in the white paper as part of the compendium from the Ecosystem for Peace on the future of environmental peace building. I think my colleague Vim put that in the link to that white paper in the chat. And you can find all of these recommendations in more detail in that document, and we can also go through them later. But specifically, I want to just highlight that the main recommendation from this is more of looking at a broader environment, peace, and security agenda that sort of filters all of this under one umbrella so that the UN system can have a uniform, coherent response and better protect civilians through this sort of more holistic, more sustainable peace building response. And then just one last slide to give you my contact information, as well as my colleagues in case you have any further questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Brittany. And yeah, this mapping is really, really useful. We've all been wondering what the impact would be of the attempt at a resolution on climate security. And since it was vetoed, how does this affect the division of labor and the mainstreaming efforts that are going on across the UN system? And that's very helpful towards that end. So let me move to the second question. The topic of protection of the environment in relation to armed conflict is gaining more attention, more research, knowledge production. We see that this really accelerated over the last decade. So I want to ask, where do you see the biggest achievements in your work on your sector to build the environment, peace, and security agenda? And again, if you can highlight specific examples or opportunities, that would be most useful. So Emilia, would you like to take this on? I think it'd be really interesting to hear a little bit more from you in respect to the humanitarian field.
Yeah, thanks so much. And thanks also for the presentations. It's very interesting and it brings up a lot of important items. In terms of what has happened and is happening, just to piggyback onto what Brittany was saying, I think definitely it's good that we see now this recognition at the highest level that the environment and security is linked. So I think in the UN as well, there's there's a lot being done on the climate and security side and analysis, and more people are working on these topics. So I think we're slowly seeing that it's creeping into the analysis and to the data. And when we're talking also about doing joint analysis for humanitarian and development actors, it's definitely coming into there. The problem, of course, and looking at the organigram, you can understand why, but it's still is disjointed and it's piecemeal. Of course, at country level, it's under the resident and humanitarian coordinators. They're trying to bring everything into one umbrella on the UN side, but of course the UN is just part of it, and so we're still struggling a little bit with making sense of all of these different issues, and when there are assessments made, it's still they're being done on individual sides. So that's maybe one thing that I still see, but I still, at least the recognition is there, and that's something I wanted to highlight. Then speaking also a little bit more concretely on what's being done in the humanitarian field, and picking up on the question which was put in the chat as well. I think one great thing, and Vanessa mentioned this, is the Climate and Environment Charter, and also the way that the UN and other organizations, humanitarian organizations, are really now, establishing environmental policies, environmental management systems. So they're bringing some kind of structure to the way they go about assessing their environmental impacts. And that should come, like in any organization, it should come, of course, with standards, with guidelines, with tools and accountability. So I just, I used to work in the private sector before, and I was a bit shocked when I started working in the NGO sphere and saw that a lot of these things which the private sector has been doing for years and years are still not like commonplace. So just have basic standards for what to do with your medical waste, basic technical standards for how you deal with certain things. It's still not commonplace. So I still find that there's this, that we can do more in terms of just getting organized about our environmental impacts. I think, again, linking to the question there in the chat, we start to see now, like, there's more of these monitoring mechanisms. There's way for people to call out when something isn't happening correctly, but it's still not sufficient. So I think that's something that we definitely need, because it's very shocking to see, and I know it happens all the time, like you say, reputable organizations which are still just not doing the basic when it comes to groundwater pollution and medical waste management. And some of these things are, nothing is ever easy, but for some of it, it's very straightforward practices, you know. It's not that complicated. So I think we should really just get to work, and at least something's happening now with the charter and the increased use of environment management systems. So that's at least something. Over.
Thank you, Emilia. And you know, looking at the questions, not only from Vishnu Preti, but also Abdallah Baed in Yemen on environmental accountability. These kinds of frameworks like the charter are a good starting point, but let's see what kinds of concrete commitments and indicators and benchmarks different actors, including private sector, can come up with, but also humanitarian organizations too, and the UN itself, right? So thank you very much. Let's then move on to Vanessa. Vanessa, based on the experience of the ICRC, what are some of the major achievements and opportunities moving forward?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Adriana. I might focus on something different and speak about sort of developments in the law in this area that I think have been pretty notable in the last couple of years. There's three general areas. I think the first and the most important is the International Law Commission's work on their currently draft principles on the protection of the environment in relation to armed conflicts. So this is a piece of work that the UNILC has been working on very hard for the last few years. They were open for state comments in the last year, and they're expected to be adopted later this year. So those principles really are a massive and significant achievement and contribution on this particular topic of the environment and protection and conflict, because they really bring together the different areas of international law that are relevant here. So IHL from the ICRC's perspective, but also human rights law and the environmental law as well. So really setting out a pretty comprehensive clarification of international law that's relevant in this area, both before, during, and after a conflict. So that's a really significant step forward for the international community. It really sums up for states what their obligations are in relation to this area. The second thing that we're pleased to have finished after some time working on them are the updated guidelines on the environment under IHL. And I think it's not so much that they are the contribution, it's rather that what they take account of is how much has developed in international law over the last 20, 30 years on the environment. So it you know, like other panelists have been speaking about, it's sometimes the importance and the significance of the developments are sort of hidden by the fact that there's not a comprehensive overarching framework. But that isn't to say that there haven't been really important developments, and that in specific contexts and on specific issues there have been great advancements. So for the guidelines on the protection of the environment under IHL, the first iteration, we released them in 1994. And the reason for the update in 2020 was to take account of all the advancements that have happened. So that includes, for example, advancements in weapons law. So, you know, the Cluster Munitions Convention and the positive impact that has on the environment. Also other weapons related advancements. But perhaps, I think for me anyway, perhaps most powerfully is really clarification of the way that the conduct of hostility rules. So what that means is the rules that parties to armed conflicts, so the fighting factions, have to respect in terms of respect for civilian objects, including the natural environment, how that applies to the natural environment, how parties to armed conflict are taking the environment into account in order to minimize damage whenever they bomb something, whenever they attack something. So I think there's really significant improvements in how states are implementing it. There's massive work to go, but nevertheless, there have been really important steps forward there. And then the third and final, I think source of real progress is there are many other initiatives being led in particular by civil society. So there's, the Geneva list of principles on the protection of water, the principles for victim assistance of toxic remnants of war. There's wide work, I'm sure we've all seen the advocacy going on around the crime of ecocide. That's not specific to armed conflict, but nevertheless is relevant in armed conflict. So I think to say that, there's clearly massive appetite and initiatives coming from civil society to clarify normative, to clarify international normative obligations, sometimes to fill gaps, but also to clarify, and then really critically to make sure that they are translated into national practice. So yeah, I would say that there's very positive momentum also in the area of international law.
Thank you, Vanessa. And I should mention that, those of us who work in areas that are not defined as armed conflict or conflict zones within international humanitarian law, we nevertheless look to these frameworks and advances for inspiration for legal advances that could apply, for instance, at the national level. We also look for convergences with developments in international development law at the intersection of environment and security. For instance, and ecocide, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because we've also been involved in the attempts to foster at least some debates within the ICC and other forums. So these sometimes even apply or serve as inspiration even more broadly beyond traditional conflict zones. Kristen, coming from a conservationist organization, where do you see opportunities for effective enhancement and minimization of risks, I should say?
Yeah, thank you. Well, building on what was already said, I think there really is an appetite to clarify a little bit more what we're talking about. So from kind of our perspective, I think one of the key challenges that we should be addressing is to make these linkages very explicit. So what really are the linkages between nature, conservation, conflicts, and how do we recognize the role that also conservation can play and how it should play that role? And for us, because this was also something that came up earlier, when we talk about conservation, we're not just talking about efforts to improve the well-being of nature, but of course, as I think Emilia has already mentioned, that people, of course, depend on nature for their livelihoods. So it's always also about the well-being of people, and only that way it can really become sustainable. So then maybe to illustrate with one example, I mean, there are many examples that we know of. We know, these little conflicts around rights over land, especially when we talk about indigenous peoples, rights or access to resources, or even natural resource exploitation when we talk about, wildlife or timber trade, which is often illegal and can actually be used as a source of financing for conflict. So these are all very important things to consider from a conservation perspective. But other kind of connections that we should, I think, talk about more and that are maybe a little bit more surprising to a lot of people is what happened, for example, in Myanmar with the Rohingya camp, or one of the refugee camps, where they actually built the camp in a location that ended up cutting off the only migratory route that elephants had. So that really caused some human-wildlife conflicts in the camp and also a number of fatalities, human fatalities. I mean, in this specific case, the refugees actually contributed in the end to remedying the situation and implemented a wildlife management program. But it really kind of illustrates that we need to think about the kind of the links between conservation, what we're doing in terms of humanitarian actions, and the connectivity between, habitats of animals and where we find humans living as well. So then within IUCN, we're already working on showing that these issues of peace and security and conflict are very critical when it comes to conservation. And we're convinced that the conservation community has a very much a positive role, but also a proactive role to play in supporting and contributing to environmental peace building. But of course, we also understand that conservation alone is not a silver bullet. We need to work together, and we need to collaborate with other organizations in this space. But what we can say is, and this is what the report is really about, that there is a lot of evidence and very robust evidence and experiences that do suggest that conservation has to be part of the solution, whether it's, in spatial planning or trying to figure out where to place a refugee camp, but it really cannot go without.
Thank you, Kristen, for bringing up those interesting examples. We've also had this experience in the Amazon and having to argue that conservation is a insufficient but necessary component of peace building in our region. Let's move on to the next question, if that's okay, because we're running out of time before Q&A, and I really wanted to get Brittany's take in particular on the issue of coordination, and anybody else who would like to speak from the panel. So Kristen, what are some particular developments, especially over the last 5 years or so, where you see a role for the UN or for broader multilateral collaboration to join forces to just bring together these different work streams as we are addressing them in the panel here today? I'm gonna pick on Brittany because I know that she's been working on this, but again, if anyone else in the panel would like to address this, please put your hand up. And then a reminder to the audience that we will have a Q&A session, so feel free to post questions in the chat box. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. In terms of sort of coordination, I think the main issue is that there's not, as I mentioned, this overarching understanding of what is needed specifically within regard to environmental protections, even in the engagement that we have with policymakers. Often if we're asking about environmental degradation issues, then they specifically come back with arguments sort of for or against climate security issues, which are of course interlinked, but not necessarily exactly overlapping, which I think is why it's much better to have a more sort of comprehensive and coherent UN maybe definition within the understanding of these sort of concepts and the ways in which they intersect and interact with one another. This also, I think, touches a bit on the political question, I guess, maybe the political sensitivities across each of these various agencies and UN bodies, as well as sort of at the national political level or regional political level as well. Of course, as I mentioned, a lot of the conversations have been within the UN Security Council because they do focus quite a lot on security issues. However, as has been mentioned by all of the other panelists, it's not just a peace and security issue, but also sort of a more comprehensive peace building issue, and it needs to also be addressed that way. So I do see, I mean, we're dealing with a Security Council right now that is extremely gridlocked on political issues across the spectrum, bringing in political sensitivities on country level situations, thematic situations. There's backsliding in the understanding of international legal principles and language that has been long established for the last 20 years or more. And so within this sort of maybe, I don't want to say hostile, but for lack of a better term, hostile political situation amongst all of those members, it's really important to have a solid understanding, a solid UN Secretariat response, and to have the data in order to be able to establish that understanding and analysis, which suggests sort of the most efficient ways in which the UN system can engage regardless of the political sensitivities of that. And I sort of see opportunities as well for, of course, the more maybe democratic bodies, such as, for example, the General Assembly, as well as within the Peacebuilding Commission more specifically, which has been starting to do some of this work as well and has been trying to take up these issues as part of their thematic and country level briefings, meetings, annual session, et cetera. So I think there are opportunities for better sort of maybe coordination by the Secretariat, but also with those member states, for example, in the group of friends on POC, the group of friends on climate insecurity, to push these the issues as a priority, to push for better understanding, better definitional establishment, development, as well as sort of requesting increased reporting in each of these areas, not just specifically within the Security Council, but also within these sort of more, these institutions with broader membership and without the veto.
Great, thank you, Brittany. As someone from a Global South organization, I always listen to these responses, trying to figure out, what are the strategic entry points also for Global South actors, organizations, but also even states and activists to participate more effectively in UN debates and initiatives. Because as we know, geopolitically speaking, not all those spaces are built equally. So for instance, having the General Assembly address this opens up a whole gamut of opportunities. I would like to ask, would anybody else on the panel like to address this issue of coordination in your particular sector? Okay, we have other questions too. So let me, I've been noting some of the questions, but also a couple of the comments, which will inspire some questions. But let me ask you a little bit about the limitations. So what are the risks and the limitations associated with this agenda? Can bringing environment and peace building sometimes lead to negative outcomes? And also what can't, for instance, the frameworks that Vanessa mentioned, or the conservation initiatives that were also brought up, what can't be done? What are the limitations and risks? Would anybody like to tackle this provocation?
Maybe I can jump in.
Yes, please.
I think for us, what we're realizing is that we're all, of course, considering these types of issues from our own respective perspectives, our expertise. And I think that in itself is already very much a limiting factor. So, of course, for IUCN, we're taking a conservation perspective. And we're not always versed in the conflict language. We're not always aware of all the different types of humanitarian approaches that are out there. But I think, and here lies a big opportunity, is that we have many actors in this space, of course, but that we can come together and we can start a dialogue around these issues. We have already started this actually with Pax for Peace quite intensively, to learn from each other, to understand better, the different types of perspectives. And we have started writing a white paper on this issue of what are actually actions for nature that we can take, and to promote a little bit more what are key actions that are possible on the governance level, on managerial level, and what types of examples can we already bring to decision makers to make this a more prominent topic. And specifically now with the upcoming UN Environmental Assembly, I think it has now been moved to April. I think this is a discussion that we really can take forward. And I also saw someone posting in the chat, what role can nature-based solutions play? I mean, of course, for IUCN, this is a key question also that we're asking ourselves. What is the role of nature-based solutions in peace building, how can we make sure that we value nature and that we apply inclusive governance processes when we make decisions at whatever level we're working at. So I think these are all really important questions. And I think although it is a limitation that we're all coming from our own perspectives, I think it's also an opportunity to then work through those perspectives together and build these more unusual partnerships between the different types of organizations working in this space.
Thank you, Kristen. Vanessa, you have the floor now.
Thanks a lot, Adriana, and a really interesting question. And I think, first of all, just to echo and agree with what Kristen has said, which is that one of the major limitations that I see, certainly from, where I sit in the legal division at the ICRC, is the fact that we're kind of generally aware that there's a lot of overlaps with all the different types of work that people do, whether it's in conservation, whether it's in the humanitarian sector, whether it's more legal, and so on and so forth. We're generally aware of the overlaps, but making those links, really speaking to each other, understanding each other's frameworks, and therefore being able to I think maximize each other's overlapping protective objectives. That is the work that needs to be done, and that is, I think, that's one of the current limitations, and I think that's where we're all trying to go. That's the purpose of the discussion today. So thank you very much, but very much agreed. There's work to do there. Then two remarks, I think, on what some of the limitations and risks are on the environment, peace, security agenda. And the first is about how we speak about climate security. And I think we're kind of probably a coalition of the convinced here, but one of the risks that we very much see at the ICRC is when we speak about climate security, or where there is discussions amongst security actors on climate security, there is really a quite clear understanding of it as a hard security. So that means a militarized response to increased insecurity based on climate risks or a mix of different issues, including climate risks. So for us, it's very important that we manage that risk by ensuring that when there are discussions of climate security, there is an understanding of it being nuanced and a broad meaning of climate security to include human security, which means that where multilateral fora respond to climate-related risks or environment, peace and security-related risks, that it is not conceived of as the traditional remit of the Security Council, which might be thought to be, militarized responses, but rather that it is the broader understanding of protection of civilians, of human security, and that is very much an inherent part of any discussion on climate security. So basically to say, make sure that there's an understanding and space to have nuance, to understand the complexity of the impacts and the fact that, there's no simple answers. This is going to be a whole system response needed. Then finally, and sort of separately, I think a risk from the legal perspective is that because it is, so if we speak about the environment, peace and security agenda and we conceive of it as a relatively new space, I think also for state actors, might be a slight tendency to misunderstand that it is a new space with no existing law, or rather, that it is sort of a new vacuum. And I think what we need to do to mitigate that risk is ensure that just like with other agendas at the Security Council, there is also included in these discussions an understanding that there is existing law here. So there's IHL, there's other, well, from the perspective of the ICRC, there's existing IHL protecting the environment. And as shown by the International Law Commission's work, there's other frameworks relevant here too, including environmental law and human rights law. So basically making sure that when we speak about climate security, when we speak about, new agendas and new frameworks, that there's an understanding that this is not a vacuum, that there are existing obligations on state actors.
Thank you, Vanessa. Indeed, the way that the debate is framed in particular spaces determines a lot or helps to shape the willingness of actors to participate. In our work, we've noticed that if we use the word peace building rather than security in Latin American contexts, that will take us much further. And in some areas where we face climate and environmental negationism, we have to talk about water more specifically and maybe leave out the broader aspect, at least temporarily. I think Emilia also wanted to pitch in. So Emilia, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the interesting discussion. It's a couple of thoughts. What I see as well is that there is really this confusion among people, what exactly we mean. What do we mean by resilience? What do we mean by, environmental accountability? Are we talking just about operations? Are we talking about programmatic decisions? Are we talking about long-term resilience? Are we talking about what we do in the coming days? We're not talking about the same things, and people have different ideas of what we should do and how we should do it. So it's hard to get onto the same page and start working together. That's one thing I wanted to mention. And the other thing that we definitely see is that there are some who want to completely change the system, throw everything out and overhaul it and completely change it. Like for humanitarian work, for example, saying this isn't working, we have to stop flying people in. We have to support local resilience instead, community-based responses. And then there are those who still, want to push for business as usual, although slightly adapted. I think everyone has to find, their own truth and their own path here, because of course we will always need both. But we can see that there's these like tensions between the two groups for sure, which also makes it hard to find a set of common objectives and get to work. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Emilia. Indeed, sometimes part of the work involves building these bridges, including across epistemic communities that historically have not dialogued until recently, but also among practitioners. Brittany, you have your hand up, so let me hand it over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, and I think perfectly situated to build off of all of these points, but including Emilia's point that we don't necessarily need to throw out, throw the baby out with the bathwater. Is that the saying? Just because certain aspects don't necessarily work doesn't mean that the entire system needs to be overhauled, I guess. But more to say that each of these different areas, because it's been such a disparate response to just needs, right? So all of the response within these various different agencies, missions, conflict situations are driven essentially by a need of protection for the environment and also for civilians, for livelihoods, civilian infrastructure, et cetera, going forward. And each of the various actors working within these sectors have responded from their own background, which is, how the system works. But more to say that I think the overarching goal here is to be able to have a more comprehensive response for more sustainable peace building overall, and then therefore more stability, better investment opportunities, development opportunities. This discussion has been had in terms of sustainable peace and development, and we're talking about how environmental and climate peace building is relevant within this sphere in order to complete that puzzle. And I think that one of the biggest issues, and I touched on this a little bit around the political sensitivities of things, is really the issue that, yes, there is these differing understandings, but within, for example, UNEA, it's the Environmental Assembly of the UN, but then there are reasons for that member states, I guess, are maybe a little bit hesitant to bring in discussions on conflict. There have been resolutions which have made the links to conflict pollution and the need for protection of the environment, but it needs to go deeper into actually bridging the conversations that are happening within the Environmental Assembly, within the Security Council, within the Peacebuilding Commission, the General Assembly writ large, and not all of these institutions, nor even the delegates from each of the member states being represented are speaking to one another And so there can be also a disconnect between what the UN, but also what member states are saying within Nairobi, within New York, within Geneva, et cetera. And this is not inherent to this discussion, but to a lot of the peace building, human rights, et cetera, discussions, but it is relevant and does have impacts here on being able to make those connections and also being able to, as you mentioned earlier, Adriana, bring in also civil society voices, the perspectives of local communities who are actually doing a lot of the most meaningful peace building and conservation work in working in rebuilding infrastructure, the governance, environmental governance, et cetera. So I think the biggest message here is that we need sort of to build these bridges for a more holistic response so that we can get a sort of cyclical investment in this from the international community, looking at not just sort of these short-term, here's a problem, we need to fix it, but then it ends up not being a systemic fix and continues on and continues to sort of have these issues resurface, but to actually do long-term investment in these environmental and climate risks in order to prevent also future resurgence of these issues. Thanks.
Thank you, Brittany. And it's interesting to think about, for instance, the creation of the UN Climate and Security Mechanism, which has, as many of you know, been developing tools for mainstreaming, right, risk analysis, early warning, early response, and other intervention designs, and how you do this and how you frame this in view of the extreme multiplicity of languages, perspectives across the UN system. So it's really interesting to follow their work and see how they try to achieve a balance, because of course all of that has political repercussions. Let me switch gears a little bit. We had a couple of comments in the chat. One was someone shared, Hasib Infanullah shared an article about nature-based solutions, but we also got a comment about greenwashing. And so I wanted to ask a little bit, because we've seen a lot of skeptical views as well as optimistic views about nature-based solution. There was, by the way, a recent article that used the expression, it was in Al Jazeera, and it used the expression climate gaslighting, which I thought was a very interesting take on the idea of greenwashing. But I wanted to ask Kristen, as a conservationist, how does IUCN view the idea of nature-based solutions, and how can we better link it to environmental peace building?
No, I think that's a very relevant question, and something that we're also looking into. We had a series of dialogues last year as part of the Geneva dialogues, environmental dialogues, and one of them actually focused on nature-based solutions for peace building. And I think there is huge potential there and a huge opportunity for us. Of course, and you mentioned greenwashing, there are many voices out there, and rightly so, that kind of caution us a little bit on how we communicate about nature-based solutions, how we discuss the implementation of it. And of course, as you're probably all aware, IUCN has developed a global standard for nature-based solutions, which is there to help with the design and implementation of such projects, and to really safeguard the core environmental and human well-being benefits that should be derived from such solutions. Of course, this also includes, and here's the biggest opportunity actually, that nature-based solutions do promote cooperation, and they aim to overcome marginalization and discrimination of various groups of society by specifically considering what are the rights and responsibilities of different groups, especially when we talk about the role of indigenous communities and their human rights, or their understanding nature and the value that nature provides. So I think by using this framework and by using inclusive governance processes, we can really use nature-based solutions to prevent conflicts, but also as a way to recover from conflicts after the war has ended as well. So there are huge opportunities. Definitely, it's a very much under-researched field, and it's something that we are looking into very closely. So hopefully there will be more discussion on this going forward as well.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Kristen. It sounded like a very balanced response to this question, which sometimes tends to draw a big umbrella over a huge concept and take one side in a very rigid manner. So we have to look for ways in which it can contribute. Would anybody else like to address the issue of nature-based solutions? We have a couple of other very different questions, I think. Okay, so we have from Gabriel Gomes Couto. He writes, this is a general question for whoever wants to address it. Do you see a role for private diplomacy and integrating mediation approaches to push forward the environment, conflict, and peace nexus? I don't know if any of you have worked directly on peace agreements and mediation, but this is a very crucial question, for instance, for DPPA and also humanitarian organizations. Yes, Emilia, please.
Yeah, I mean, just some quick comments. I mean, I think definitely, you know, environment and natural resources has a very important role to play in diplomacy and in mediation and in environmental peace building. It's something that UNEP has done a lot of work on, and I think there are some good examples, and that's something that we see now that is absolutely essential. It has to be part also of any peace building process, of course. I'm personally I have not been that much involved, so I can't, you know, come up with any concrete examples where I was involved myself, but for sure.
Thank you, Emilia. Would anybody else like to jump in?
I can maybe just say a couple of comments. Again, similarly, I have not worked on any peace building or peace mediation. It's not really the work of the ICRC, but I am aware that others are using the environment as a space that is kind of hopefully slightly more consensual, or can be slightly more consensual depending on the conflict as an entry point. I know that, yes, I think it's just been put in the chat, humanitarian dialogue. UNEP and others are really starting to think about this more concretely. Separately, on the issue of sort of private and private bilateral dialogue, the ICRC certainly sees a massive role for that. Not in the peace building sector, but rather in the during conflict, in the improvement of the environmental practice of parties to armed conflict. So that really is, I think, our main mode of work, and it is kind of the not particularly well known, and the impact can be incremental, but nevertheless can make differences to improving, you know, the really nitty-gritty boring stuff of what the military manual says about what can be attacked and when, you know, and to what extent environmental damage is even understood by militaries, what kind of experts they have therein in order to support assessments of military conduct and military operations. And so that is another space that is, you know, one of the many spaces where private bilateral dialogue, I think, can really play a role. But just to say, I think really influencing the behavior of conduct of parties to armed conflict while the fighting is going on is also an important area that I think needs a space.
Thank you, Vanessa. Yeah, Brittany, please.
I just want to jump in, similarly to the other panelists, this is not my area of expertise. However, my colleagues within PACS have been working specifically on sort of accountability measures. So not necessarily specific, I mean, in some aspects, yes, involved in peace mediation within the private sector, but really looking at, for example, in the London Energy case in Sweden, specifically looking at the impacts that those private companies had within the conflict in Sudan and South Sudan, and supporting the victims of those cases to be able to take those, excuse me, sorry, the New York streets are a bit loud, to those cases and for seeking accountability within the national legislatures as well. So it's not necessarily specifically peace mediation, but I do think that, of course, when you're talking about a holistic or comprehensive response, that you need to be engaging with all of the stakeholders, all of the actors that are working in that area in the conflict, et cetera, who actually have a role to play, whether that is, for example, in mitigating the risks that they're causing by, for example, extracting natural resources, or whether that is in rebuilding infrastructure as well within a sustainable development or reconstruction aspect too. Thanks.
Thank you, Brittany. And if I may interject very briefly, here in Latin America, at CIPO, we've done a brief mapping of peace agreements that incorporate environmental aspects. And one of the interesting cases, and it seldom gets cited in the international literature, so I'd like to bring it up, is there was an interstate conflict, a very long-lasting conflict between Ecuador and Peru. And part of the solution, and this was drawn up in, I think, the 1980s and 90s, was the establishment of a binational conservation unit and institutions that go along with it. And this kind of precedes this overt conversation about environmental peace building. But it's the point is that there are practices, and sometimes they're not framed in the exact same way, but we can find examples of where mediation, even at the interstate level, has involved environmental components. At the local level in the Amazon, when we talk about local mediation, what we see is the development of more inclusive governance of natural resources and mediation working towards that goal in a lot of different communities, not just here in Brazil, but also Ecuador, Colombia, and so forth. So it's a very, I think, a very timely topic at different levels. I have a final question. I'm very interested in this too, because we are working in the cities of the Amazon. Nigel Go asks, are there examples of cities and other urban centers which have influenced, whether positively or negatively, environmental protection and peace building? So do any of you have any takes on an urban aspect of environmental peace building? And then we'll have to wrap up because we're running out of time. Okay. No hands up, which I think is a good sign that we need a panel on this next edition of the conference. We do have some other questions, but we're running out of time, so we won't have enough time, but I wanted to highlight one that I think maybe is a good takeaway question, which is, what is your advice for donors? And maybe if any of you have a last word on this, what would you say to a donor in your field in one sentence? If you don't mind, I'll go around and then we'll wrap up. Emilia, what would you say to a donor that asked you about environmental peace building?
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard question. One sentence. Keep engaging on this topic and provide resources and join up approaches domestically as well, because like we said, there's a lot of coordination to be done, and they can start by coordinating within their own ministries and countries.
Absolutely, very necessary. Kristen, what would you say?
I would say that there are a lot of very, very exciting opportunities ahead of us, and we just need the resources to explore them.
Thank you. Vanessa?
Yeah, similarly, I think making links between partners and making links between organizations that are working on this is the next step, and we need resources to do that. So basically encourage partnership and understand that partnership requires resources to make them work.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. And Brittany?
yeah, so to, of course, support all of the ways in which my fellow panelists have suggested, but specifically, for example, within the context of the Security Council, I guess, put your money where your mouth is in terms of supporting climate advisors, reporting mechanisms, etc. So ensure that within the 5th committee, that resources are being allocated to support the mandates that are given, even limited mandates that are given at the moment within the Security Council, and also support extra budgetary positions to help to coordinate and gather the data and ensure that communities are involved in the analysis and gathering of this data as well. Is that one sentence or a million?
That's a long sentence, but it's a,
yeah.
it's a one. So thank you very much. Let me use my prerogative as moderator to also pitch in. I would request donors that in providing or allocating resources, they be very careful not to channel away resources from development and other areas of climate action, including loss and damage, that are already not keeping pace with commitments. So we need to be very careful and very innovative in how we find these very necessary resources. I hope that all of you enjoyed the debate. I did immensely, and I learned a lot about coordination, about legal frameworks, the role of conservation, humanitarian settings. I think we opened up a whole range of new questions, maybe for new panels and initiatives. But I also wanted to thank the organizers, thank our tech support, our brilliant translators. Hopefully we've done a good job in slowing down our speech. And also to our audience, it's unfortunate that we cannot be together, but the virtual format does allow more of us, including here in the Global South, to take part. So hopefully see you in other panels, and we'll continue this discussion in other settings. Thank you very much.
Thank you.